Hello everyone. In this video, we'll go through state hooks in React. But before getting into state hooks, we need to understand what hooks really are. So, what are hooks? Hooks are special functions that let you use different React features in your components. They are either built into React or you can create your own custom hooks. Hooks were introduced in React 16.8, but before they were introduced, you had to use class components for features like state and lifecycle methods. Hooks will allow you to do all of that with functional components, which are simpler and easier to read. There are different kinds of built-in hooks in React for different purposes, which are state hooks, context hooks, reference hooks, effect hooks, performance hooks, and other hooks. In this video, we will only go through state hooks. We'll go through remaining of the hooks in later videos. Before diving into state hooks, we need to understand what components and states are. Components are the core concept of React. Think of a component as a custom HTML element that you can create, reuse, and control with JavaScript. Just like HTML has tags such as button, div, table, and UL, we can create React components like counter, navbar, and to-do item. Each of these components can render HTML, hold data, which is state, and handle user actions. Let's look at the two snippets of the code. One is in HTML and the other one is a React component. The difference between these two approaches is that HTML version is static and doesn't change when the user clicks the button. However, the React component is dynamic. Clicking the button updates the state, which is the counter, and the HTML automatically re-renders state. So, what is a state? In simple terms, state is a component's memory. Components often need to change what is displayed on the screen as a result of user interaction. For example, typing in a form should update the input field, clicking next on an image carousel should change the displayed image, or clicking an add to cart button should add a product to the shopping cart. To perform these actions, components need to remember things such as current input value, the current image, or the items in shopping cart. This kind of component-specific memory is called state in React. For example, in the counter component, the variable count is the state of the component. It stores the current count value, serving as a component's memory. When you call setCount to count plus 1, React updates the state, re-renders the component, and displays the new value inside the count. A state does look like a variable of a component. So what is the difference between these two? A React component re-renders when its state changes. Re-renders means it reruns its render logic. This is the fundamental difference from a regular variable. Changing state tells the React to update the UI, whereas changing a local variable does not trigger a re-render. State is persistent memory, while variables reset on re-renders. Now we know what the state is and why we need it. Let's look into state hooks. React provides two state hooks to add state to a component, which are useState and useReducer. Now let's look into useState hook. UseState hook allows you to add a state variable to a component and update it over time. If you look at the syntax below, x is the variable that holds the current value or state. setX is the function that is used to update the state value of x. The parameter initial x sets the initial value of x. Could be a number, string, array, or an object. What are the uses of state hooks? State hook is used to add a state to a component, update state based on previous state, update objects and arrays in state, avoiding recreating the initial state, resetting state with a key, and storing information from renders. Now let's look into the uses of this hook. It is used to add state to a component, update state based on previous state, update objects and arrays in the state, avoiding recreating the initial state, resetting the state with a key, and storing information from previous renders. Now, let's look into useReducer hook. useReducer hook is used to manage complex logic in a functional components. It is an alternative to useState and is especially useful when the state has multiple related values, the state update depends on the previous state, you have complex logic, and you want more predictable state management. If you look at the syntax below, the state is the current state value. Dispatch means a function used to send actions. A reducer is a function that decides how the state changes. The initial state is the starting value of the state. What are the uses of useReducer hook? It is used to add a reducer to a component, writing the reducer function, and avoiding recreating the initial state. useReducer can be a bit confusing at first, but we'll build a form component using both useState hook and useReducer hook later in the video to make it super clear. Create another folder called pages. Inside this folder, we'll create a component called form. This form component will render a login form. In React, the file name of the component and the component name should always start with a capital letter. Now, let's start by importing useState hook. Next, we define the form component using export default function form. The default keyword is optional. Because we are exporting this form component by default, we are using default keyword. Inside this component, we'll manage user input, validation, and error messages. Now, we create state variables called email and password using useState hook. By default, it will be an empty string. So what happens here is that React creates a place to store email and password and also gives us the set email and set password functions to update them. This allows our component to remember what the user types in. Now, let us create another state called errors. This is an object that will store validation messages and we can use set errors to update these messages. By default, it will be an empty object. Next step, we'll add a return statement to our component. Inside this return statement, we'll add the HTML form tag, input fields, and a submit button. The form has an onSubmit event handler that fires when the submit button is clicked, and it will run the handle submit function. In the email input field, when the user types in, the unchanged event fires. React captures the value, set email updates the state, and React re-renders the component. This means the email state always contains at least one input. The same thing will happen for the password field. So now let us add in the password field. Add in the password state that we have defined before. Next, we add the submit button after closing this input field, input tag. Next, let us add the handle submit function. As you can see, we have passed in the event object over here and use prevent default. So why are we doing this? By default, when a form is submitted, the page refreshes and all data disappears. But we don't want that. So to prevent browser's default behavior, we use e.preventDefault. E is an event triggered by the browser. We haven't defined the validate function. We'll define it later. We will check if the validation error is empty or not. If it's empty, then the login is successful. If it's not, then we'll set errors. Next, we'll define the validate function. But this will do basic validation. For instance, for email, we'll check if the email address contains @ or not. If it doesn't contain @ symbol, then we will flag the email as invalid. We will add another validation for password field. So if the length of password is less than 6, then we'll mark the password as invalid. If you look at the code over here, it's showing a red underline over here. It says errors is declared, but its value is never read. It's because we have declared this error variable, but we have never used it. So let's use it to show an error. So for email, under return statement, we have b errors dot email. Similarly, for password, we'll add it. What it does, it will display the error message for email and password fields, respectively. Now, Everything looks good. Now let's run the code npm run tape. Because we're using void, our tape server is up and running. Let's open this URL in the browser now. As you can see, our form component is successfully loaded. Now, if I click on login button over here, you will see the error messages saying valid email is required and password must be 6 character long because both of which are filled. So if I type in 4 characters of password, you still see the message, but if I type in 6 characters, then the password error message is gone. Similarly, if I type in like dummy email address, which looks valid, then we'll get the login successful alert. Now, let us create the same form using useReducer code. So under pages, create a new file called with reducer, import reducer code. Now we'll export the default component. Inside this component, we'll define the initial state of each fields. We will use the useReducer hook, reducer function, and the initial state that we define. So we're missing an I over here. That looks good now. So we'll define the reducer function. Should be reducer over here, not use reducer twice. We'll pass state and action as the parameters. We'll use switch case to switch between the action types. So the first case is while we're trying to update the input field. When we're typing it, when updating the input field, we want to return state and action field and value. Next case would be setting errors. Done. It's when we reset the form. It usually happens after we submit the form and the submission is successful. Return state. By default, we'll return the state. Now we have the reducer function done. Let's add in the validate function to the similar function that we added in our previous component. We'll do similar sort of validation for email and password field. Why? Now we'll add another validation for password field. Now state the password. The length is less than 6. Now we'll return the errors. We'll write in the handle submit function. It will be a similar sort of function that we have written previously in the form component. We will dispatch set errors if there is an error. If everything is all good, we will alert login successful and dispatch reset. Now let's add a return statement to this component where we'll have our form UI and input fields and the submit button. We'll also add in the validation error messages as well. Value is state.email and on change, pass in the events dispatch. It's email and value is the we'll add in a paragraph tag to show error message for email field, which will be. Next, we'll add in the input field for password. Field, we need to define field as password. We need a submit button as well. But first, we'll define the paragraph tag to display error message for password. So now components looks ready. So let's import this component in app.jsx. Oh, oh, wait, reducer. Oh, let's comment out the previous form. Let's get rid of this. As you can see on the browser, our new form has loaded up fine. Now if I click on login, it will say valid email is required and password must be less than 6 characters. Must be at least 6 characters. So if I add password, login, let's look at the purposes for the email. If I add in some sort of valid email address, then we'll see login successful alert. So in simple terms, useState is like managing many small boxes, and useReducer is like having one manager that is controlling everything. So useState is simple and great for smaller components, but useReducer becomes very powerful when a form or logic becomes bigger and more complex. For instance, if I got like more than 5 or 10 different fields, then useState will be a nightmare to manage. But if it's like a small component, like you see over here, like simple login form, useReducer adds more logic and it's a bit more code to write down. In a nutshell, use useState if it's simple and if the component is very small, else use useReducer.